Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Leigh, Assistant Director of Academic Affairs at the Cleveland Museum of Art. Welcome back to Close Looking at a Distance. Here we give our sustained attention to works of art in order to expand our understanding of the world and of each other. So we're going to start in a moment to give guests some time to continue to log in. But in the meantime, please familiarize yourself with the Q&A interface at the right of your screen. Because while I certainly have ideas and information to share with you about the works that we're going to be viewing and that we'll talk about, the success of this program relies on your participation. So a Q&A that's alive with your comments and questions is our goal. When commenting, you may include your name or remain anonymous. Also, you can use the Q&A to read and like your fellow participants' responses and comments, because this will also help me to guide our discussion as we move along. We'll also use this area to post links to the artworks we show, any other resources we mention, as well as any polls or surveys. If you look in the Q&A right now, you'll find a link to a survey that allows us to get to know you a little better that you can complete at any point over the course of the program. Okay, let's get started. Since we can't be together in a group in the galleries, in this program, we've taken the experience of spending time together face-to-face virtual. So that we can continue to discuss artworks. And so for those of you who are new to Close Looking, I want to say just a little bit about what it is as a practice. If we break it down, the close in Close Looking implies the intimacy and care with which we'll consider each work that comes under discussion, but we will also take care to respect each other in our questions and comments. And looking in this virtual space means that as we move from detail to detail and question to question, we collectively pursue meaning. And I also want to pause here and express my own gratitude for your participation, especially in the constantly shifting social landscape that makes new demands on each of us every day. It's a beautiful thing, and I thank you for taking a time out of your day to share these conversations with each other. At the conclusion of last week's desktop dialogue, Andrew Capetta and Seth Pevnick, who had been discussing some ancient origins for our national archetypes of leadership, showed Barack Obama's presidential portrait by Kehinde Wiley, a link to which you'll find in the Q&A, and describe some ways that Obama's race and Wiley's interpretation of a presidential portrait broke with previous conventions. And today we'll consider two contemporary artworks through which the artists also revise artistic conventions in ways that directly address and disrupt disparate representations by centering Black women's experiences, which have been routinely erased or subverted and which complicate and defy canonical characteristics of power. So as we consider each artwork, we'll describe and interpret what attributes or characteristics are presented and how they relate to ideas of power and leadership. And we begin with a work from the CMA's permanent collection by Simone Lee called Las Meninas. It was created in 2019 and collected by the museum that same year. Much of Lee's body of work centers on Black women's representation and experiences. Her practice, about which you can discover more through an article and YouTube video that we will place in the links to which we will place in the Q&A as well. So her body of work spans sculpture, video, performance, as well as community-based projects. Her sculptures, which demonstrate her background in ceramics, challenge notions of pottery as a craft that would be held separate from the creation of fine art sculpture by blending both in her creations and reinterpretations of the classic nude. Lee purposefully mixes diasporic cultural codes to engage in an expansive dialogue about Blackness, otherness, difference, and the spaces of women's labor. So I want to give you a moment to look at this piece on your screen. As I briefly describe the image, I invite each of you to enter things that you see or questions you may have in the Q&A. And if another participant posts a comment or question that you'd like us to explore, make sure you like it. That helps us, that helps me to see where consensus lies and where we go next. All right, let's get into it. So Las Meninas, which you're seeing on your screen, measures 72 inches high, 84 inches wide, and 60 inches in diameter. So it's quite a skirt. And it's approximately a life-size figure. The head, to which we will certainly return, and nude torso appears white in color. Its breasts are bared, and each arm is bent at an angle, elbows jutting outward, such that the figure's hands, held in fists, rests on either side of its waist, and there's a small indentation of a navel on the figure's stomach. Then right below the figure's waist, the party begins in this four-tiered explosion of raffia. Raffia, which is the name of the tree from which this fiber comes, as well as the fiber itself, is a palm tree native to tropical Africa and Madagascar. And the fiber that we see is the dried fiber from the leaves of that palm tree. And it forms this incredible domed skirt. And Sean, if we can pull out to the full view, I ask our audience, what do you see? If you could only choose one adjective to describe this sculpture, what would it be? We have an anonymous who says, determined woman. What do you see that makes you say determined? What about this figure reads as determined? And maybe if we can pull in to sort of the upper body of the figure, Sean. Because I can agree with determination, but I wonder what aspects specifically about this sculpture make you think of determination. I immediately think of powerful, and maybe there's some similar reasons that we are considering that. Andrew says there's no face, a bare chest, and a disproportionately large skirt, so pointing to the formal qualities of the work, so letting us know that even that we have this life-size figure, that skirt is really quite a large part of the composition of this sculpture. I see that determination is something that lots of folks agree with. The position of the arms, we have an anonymous commenter. So yes, this kind of, and I invite everyone at home to try this position. Put your hands by your sides, put your fists at your waist. What does that feel like? How does that feel when you place yourself in that position? So determination, a kind of, which makes me feel almost, or think about motion. So there is a solidness, there is a I am here-ness about this sculpture. And also determined because of the arms and fists, right? There's something really deliberate and exaggerated about the way those elbows jut out to the sides and those fists at the waist. Joanne says that the posture is very firm and defensive, perhaps aggressive even. And also, will that raffia last? We can come back to that. Also, the posture is incredibly tall and proud, so an erect spine. These are all body positions and shapes that artists have represented as indicators of power and of gravity, of importance. Joanne says very rooted. Yes, sort of rooted to the ground. We can't see the figure's feet, but maybe if we pull out, Sean, can we look at the whole figure again? Thank you. Let's maybe think a little bit about this raffia skirt, which, as Andrew noted, points out, it takes up a very large space. It's 60 inches in diameter, which is quite wide. And I don't know who among you has seen this sculpture, which is on view right now in our contemporary art galleries. what impression it gave you, or how that skirt, what impression the skirt, or what it may make you think of. What does that shape bring to mind? For me, I often think immediately about the sound this kind of skirt would make if the figure stepped forward. That kind of shh sound that it might make, which to me is also a declaration of I'm here, the idea of taking up space and making sound. And I'm also considering, oh, a haystack. Thank you, Joanne. So yes, potentially a haystack. So I don't know if you, anytime I ride through any sort of farm country, those sort of large stacks of wheat or hay, absolutely. So there's something very natural that we are seeing here. And also I think about that sort of dry sound that hay might make when wind blows through it. What else might this shape bring to mind? A dome, yeah, so something that's covering something. So I think of maybe even like a bell jar, but also like domiciles, houses and homes with these sort of domed tops. Or even a bell. This might be a good time to bring up one of the references that we know Simone Lee had when she was creating this work, which is called Las Meninas. And there is a 16th century painting by the artist Diego Velasquez by the same name called Las Meninas. Oh, that was, I was thinking the idea, at least the idea of being bountiful. We will definitely return to that anonymous. So if we could take a moment just to look at this painting that we know that Simone Lee was referencing, is there a figure that you think immediately brings to mind that sculpture? Kind of a leading question, but maybe not. Let's see. Separation and protection. We'll get back to that. Let's draw closer to the foreground, please, Sean. Perfect. Are there any immediate similarities or immediate differences that you spy between that sculpture and the work that's on the screen now? And we've also put a link to that that painting in the Q&A. Oh, thatched roof cottages. We will definitely come back to the Simone Lee. Actually, can we, Sean, let's take a detour back to the Simone Lee if we could. We've got lots of comments coming in about that skirt. So Joanne was thinking of thatched roof cottages, which is also, yes, absolutely something that Simone Lee was thinking about. She's particularly thinking about the homes that are in particular communities in Western Africa, but it also makes me think of English thatched roof cottages. Karen is noting that because of its size and proportion to the body of the figure, that it seems that the skirt provides separation and protection. That's really interesting. Yes, something that large and domed will keep people at a distance, at a particular distance from their bodies. So there is this notion of protection of that figure, even as her torso is completely bare here. There is a protection that's provided by, and we can relate, I think, in our social distance circumstances of sort of thinking about how what we arrange around us either brings closer to us or farther away. Oh, and so now we're also seeing some of the similarities and differences. Is it possible, Sean, for us to put both Las Meninas together? Thank you so much. Perfect. So someone was focusing on the young woman at the center of the painting Las Meninas, and Las Meninas translates into ladies in waiting. So maybe if we can get a bit closer to the little girl in the center of the foreground of the Velasquez painting. Thanks, Sean. And it is, many of the women in this image are wearing those sort of bell skirts. So there's a similarity in the shape between the skirts that we're seeing in the painting, which does connote royalty. So I will let you know that who we're looking at in the Velasquez painting. So Velasquez was a court painter for the king and queen of Spain, and the small girl in the foreground is the infanta, or the princess, Marie Therese, and this is a portrait ostensibly of her, with a lot of other things happening. And Anonymous pointed out a very distinct difference, that the Leigh sculpture is a singular figure, while the Velasquez is very much part of a group of figures. So if we can draw out again, Sean, on the Velasquez, or move around, we can see right behind that grouping of three young women in the foreground is the painter himself, Velasquez, a self-portrait, which was, so this Velasquez painting, like the Simone Lee, is breaking with some convention by inserting himself into the painting. This is in an era before artists were really signing their works and making themselves, having a kind of celebrity. So these are early days there. But also we see that the Infanta is part of an ensemble of royalty, whereas the Simone Lee sculpture, that figure stands alone. And so Emily notes that the little girl skirt is similar, but thinks that the motherly figure is more similar in size, which could reflect protection and doting. So I'm thinking that Emily's thinking about the figure that's standing and curtsying next to the Infanta. And so, yes, there is, in proportion to the body, maybe that is even more similar to the Leigh, that standing way far out. And then even her posture toward the Infanta connotes this kind of protection and doting. That's great observation. Thank you. And thank you also, Jackie, for putting in another article about Simone Lee, thinking about how her work has moved into the mainstream. So if we can go back to the Simone Lee alone for a moment, Sean, because this life-size figure is part of a larger body of work of Simone Lee's, in which she makes these monumental sculptures that include these sort of intertwined dome and women's figures together. I want us to maybe sort of pull apart this sculpture a little bit more. Can we get as close as we can to the head of this figure, which I think is particularly interesting? Great, thank you. So what I'll do is I'll ask the audience again, what do you notice as you look at this head? And I'm just going to give you a moment. You can pop your thoughts into the Q&A. The first thing that I notice is that there is no face, which Andrew also noticed, that there is no face. And so when we think about the idea of a classical nude painting or sculpture in art history, typically there's a face. And so that is one very overt way in which Leigh is breaking with convention. But it's not only faceless, but also hollow. So there is a cavity that is carved out into what is ostensibly a head. And Tolu, thank you, says you are forced to peer inside of it, right? And so there's something really fascinating about the denial of what your mind expects when it looks at a particular kind of object. So typically, if we saw just from the neck down of this figure, we would expect to meet a face. And then also the idea of looking at a face when you are a viewer of an art object. Typically, there's either a meeting or not meeting of your gaze, but this denies your gaze, but also forces you to look deeper into to try to understand even what's happening. So here's another way that Leigh is sort of undermining the conventions or the expectations that we have of particular kinds of artwork. Joanne says it looks kind of like a lamprey, right? So like a completely other sort of creature with sort of it could be like a yawning mouth. Karen asks, is it a ring of little porcelain roses? So there are these sort of little rosette shapes. And this maybe gives us a chance to talk a little bit about how this object is made. So when I said that Leigh is invested in ceramics, that is very true in that this piece is glazed terracotta. And so each of those little rosettes would have been formed out of clay, placed and adhered, and then fired, because that's the process that takes us from clay to what's called biscuit. So it's really transforms from a soft to hard and becomes a completely different kind of thing. And then it is glazed and fired again. And that's what gives us these different colors and the sheen that you'll find if you get close to this. And so, yes, there's a little ring, there's a ring of little porcelain rosettes. So there's this idea of the floral, but it also is similar to the shape of a cowrie shell, which they fold in on each other, which globalizes this notion of these little rosettes, brings it out of, brings us into both a natural context, but also makes us think a little bit differently about geography. One of our participants has said it's a wreath shape that feels very welcoming. So maybe an invitation to look inside of it rather than a sort of confrontation. Emily says it's like a vortex going inward, reflecting an inner self. So the ways in which we might read the face of a portrait or of a nude or of a model and decide about their emotions, this helps us to think about the complexities, the unknown, the unknowability of someone's real interiority, but this invites us to contemplate that. It's a great point. Someone asks, is the face ceramic, porcelain like the bust? It certainly is. And so that is definitely true. Welcoming a sort of beautiful wreath. Thank you so much. Joanne asked, were the rosettes attached then fired or fired then attached? I believe that they were attached then fired, but that's something I would need to double check on, and we'll give you some avenues to ask that question at the end of the program. Let's pull out a little bit again, Sean. And this also lets us think about some ways that artworks ask something of us. So as Tolu noted, there's a demand that we sort of look inside of this object, but at the same time, we have that skirt that keeps us at a distance. So there is this kind of protective quality. And one of the things that I believe Leigh is thinking about are the ways that women, and particularly Black women, have not always had the space of refusal, of refusing the gaze, right? And so that our gaze as viewers. And so I think that when we think about classical nudes, and even in the ways that they've been discussed in art history, they are objects for the delectation, the consumption, the view of for the viewer, not they are become objects rather than subjects. And in this way, if you can refuse the gaze in particular ways, or as a few of you have pointed out, complicated that gaze, made it be about the viewer, because in some ways that we have to move around, we have to peer inside, indicates us as viewers, lets us know, makes us focus on the act of viewing this figure's body. And so what I'd like to do is to also think about her other references in some ways for that skirt. So we might think about, so I said in the beginning that Simone Lee is thinking about a lot about Black women's experiences and their stories, but here we are looking at this very white figure, right? And so there are some questions because a lot of the figures are very, very Black. They are still ceramic, but they are glazed differently to produce a sort of Black skin versus this white skin. However, I think that she's often playing with these identities. How is it that immersed in the almost always in the art historical record white female nude? How does that fit into this more global diasporic story of womanhood that she's trying to convey? So she's drawing on these sort of thatched roofs and homes of African cultures, but also thinking about in the South, there is a restaurant and it's called Mammy's Cupboard. And it is essentially a Aunt Jemima figure created where the dome of her skirt is the actual restaurant and you enter into her skirts to be nurtured. And so I will give you a quote from Simone Lee about this. She said that in a different series of work, not these, but still with the dome, she refers to a place in Mississippi. It's in Natchez, Mississippi, called Mammy's Cupboard. And the skirt where the patrons would enter to eat. And I quote, "I thought the symbolic violence in this gesture of going to eat in someone's skirt was really stunning, and that it symbolically tells a larger story about the experience of Black women and femmes. I've been interested in the symbolic parts of that building since I encountered it in a photograph." So the kind of mashup that we see here, because this skirt also refers to the skirts worn by women in an Afro-Brazilian religious tradition called candomblé, which means dance in honor of the gods, and is a syncretic religion that brings together the Yoruban tradition from West Africa with Roman Catholic tradition. So she's thinking about all of these different ways that women's experiences can be represented through, but in defiance of traditional art histories. An anonymous comment that says, "Now that I see the inside is hollow, the stance and the skirt make me think of hollow arrogance." That's really interesting. So knowing a little bit more detail about how the object is made or getting a closer look has made this viewer think about a kind of, there may be a disconnect or a contrast or a tension between the hollowness of the head and the power of the stance. Thanks very much for that. I think that we should take a look at another work by a different artist that is also thinking about how she can revise the art historical record to make present Black women's experiences and stories differently. We're going to look at this portrait of the former First Lady Michelle Obama by the artist Amy Sherald. So this portrait, which is called officially Michelle LaVaughn Robinson Obama, is similar in size, though it's in 2 dimensions rather than 3, to the Simone Lee sculpture. So it is about 72 inches tall and about 60 inches wide, and so roughly life size. And if you haven't had the opportunity to see it in person, it's definitely worth it. And so she's in an abundant gown that is designed by one of her favorite designers, Michelle Smith, who in an interview with Vogue has said that the dress is clean, minimal, geometric print is without a reference to anything past or nostalgic, and is forward thinking, which is the way that that designer thinks of Michelle Obama herself. It's oil on linen, and what Sherald has said about her own approach to portraiture is that it's deeply conceptual. And Michelle Obama herself has emphasized that she did not come from the sort of family that had members sit for portraits. And as a variation of the classical sort of American pioneer, she sought out Sherald for her portrait to translate what being first meant to her. What did it mean to be the first Black First Lady? Take a moment to look at it now. What do you notice as you are viewing this work? And I see we have a few already. So we have an anonymous commenter who said that, you know, it's a shame that quote, white, unquote, was considered more beautiful or appropriate than Black. I wish that the artist would have celebrated the true and natural depiction of this figure with her proud Blackness. Her pose gives us the impression that she could handle any criticism of her looks, and I believe that's in reference to the Leigh. But in some ways, I think it can connect to this portrait of Michelle Obama as well. And one of the things that, while I also find interesting about this Michelle Obama portrait, is the fact that the skirt also takes up so much of the composition. The way that we were noting the skirt in the Simone Lee takes up so much space. So there is something here about taking up space. And I'm wondering what you think about power here. So we thought about both the size of the skirt, the stance of the figure in the Simone Lee denoting power, although complicated. Maybe it's haughtiness as well. And arrogance can be an element of power, I think. But is there a characteristic or attribute here that you read as powerful or not? And what might those be? Maybe we can pull just a little bit closer, please, Sean. Thank you so much. Confidence, someone has said. And what do you see that makes you say confidence? I repeat this pretty much every session, but when I'm with my students and they tell me that what attribute something has, I tell them they have to prove it in the paint. So what specifically reads as confident in this portrait of Michelle Obama? Emily says it reflects Michelle as a modern, forward-moving female, and I wonder, again, how? How does it do it? Is it the dress, the print of the dress? Is it the way that her body is positioned? Is it the expression on her face? What aspects make you see that? So here, Anonymous says they don't see arrogance, but they see humility and strength. Can we get just a little bit closer to her face, Sean? And Andrew notes that there's been some discussion about the painting not looking like Michelle Obama. Why might that decision have been made? That's a really interesting question and point. It is, in some ways, I think about a breaking with convention in thinking that portraits have to look exactly like the person, that there needs to be a one-to-one translation of the features onto the canvas, but we can get back to that. I just want to make sure that we don't lose our thread about what about this makes her seem either humble or confident or powerful. And so someone has said her gaze gives us this indication, and I can see that there's not a smile on her face, and her gaze, which I've seen this in person, and it is, I felt as though she was appraising me as I was attempting to appraise her, that there is something that is a bit reserved about this, or the eye contact, as Eileen noted. We also have Stephanie that says it looks like Michelle is relaxed and confident in this space, that she takes up so much space in the composition and she doesn't apologize for it. Her chin resting on her hand makes her feel relaxed and calm, but powerful with her direct gaze. Let's pull out again a little bit, Sean, because I think that there is, even though her posture is a bit relaxed with one arm over her lap, the other with her head resting, but her spine remains pretty straight and her head is resting but not tilted down. There is a directness, an outward appraisal that is happening here. There are also her very signature strong arms. I remember that, you know, Michelle Obama's arm workout was extremely popular, but also from her detractors noted as not being feminine, as a attribute that we're reading as powerful, but was also read as not womanly by those who didn't see her as a sort of proper representation of womanhood. And Joanne also noted that the gaze is very direct. Someone has noted that the fabric reminds them of the patterns and colors that tribal regions identified with. And so it's really interesting, these kinds of geometric patterns. So we had the designer who who said there's no reference for it. It is really mimicking how she translated her understanding of Michelle Obama as a woman. But the artist, Amy Sherald, noted that it reminded her of Mondrian. It immediately brought up ideas from other artworks and art history that she thinks about and references. And so I think that this lends to the kind of timelessness, this idea that we can each find different sorts of references just in that dress, is an important way of thinking about how you make a figure that doesn't typically fit in the conventions of what a first lady is maybe meant to look like, is by surrounding her in this timeless quality. We don't know where she is either. That blank background doesn't give us a sense of place. And if we think about the Barack Obama portrait, even though it's full of flowers, again, this is this way that he can sort of slip in and out of historical moments. There's a timelessness to their representations. Joanne noticed that she remembers the big deal about how when Michelle Obama exposed her arms, it was not a thing that was done before. You didn't walk around with bare arms, that it was maybe even considered, you know, not as respectable, but we wonder if it is why it is that her showing her arms was particularly considered particularly untoward. So I think that what we are witnessing in these two, in this painting here, is that the notion of power is very present, but it isn't maybe as defensive as someone noted earlier, as or confrontational about as the Simone Lee. I will say that some critics have noted that the sort of evidence of power is a little bit more elusive in Amy Sherald's works. So her models are Black, but she uses, and if we can get closer again, thank you, Sean. One thing that we didn't talk about or note was the sort of grayscale that she uses to depict skin. And I just want to note that someone says that they love the deep blue background that there is in this painting that matches the way they perceive Michelle Obama to have such a calming presence. Yeah, so there isn't, even in the distinction between the color of her skin and the background, it's all this sort of cool tone. It's bringing the heat way down. She obviously could have selected to choose like the warm brown of her actual skin, to have some sort of hot background, which would give us a very different, or to contrast the colors in that background, which would have given us something very different. Oh gosh, we only have 5 minutes remaining. Oh no. So I will say that this Grayscale, and we did place Amy Sherald's website in the Q&A, so you can take a little bit of a deeper dive into her body of work. She uses this Grayscale, also called grisaille, to also lend this kind of timelessness to the figures. They become monumental, very sculptural, when they are painted in this way. And while it's accomplished in a very different sort of way, Sherald is also amending our historical traditions of who can be First Lady by depicting the first Black First Lady in a way that both engages but also revises conventional portraiture. And we're going to put a link in the Q&A that shows all of the other official portraits of First Ladies. And they aren't all very traditional, particularly I think about Jackie Kennedy's portraits. And some of the earlier portraits are very expressionistic, but she still is breaking with those conventions in various ways. So I want to, before we close, I just want to take another moment to reiterate that today what we've been doing is seeing how two contemporary artists are reimagining art history to not just insert, but to transform art history by including the people, narratives, stories, ideas that have always been there, but haven't always been elevated to visibility. And I want to thank each of you again for participating today, because I truly believe that we can learn more about our world and ourselves by taking the time to dwell on these artworks together. Thank you for joining us for Close Looking at a Distance, which has been made possible by the National Endowment for the Humanities. And our next Close Looking at a Distance program will take place on October 14th at noon, and I hope that I'll see you all again then. And now my colleague Andrew Capetta is going to tell you a little bit about the next desktop dialogue. So here's Andrew.
Hey, thank you, Joe. Great program. Thanks again. No, next week we have off, so please join us for desktop dialogues, which will be in 2 weeks on October 7th at noon. I'm going to be joined by New York-based artist Maria Yoon and CMA curator Swan McCormick to discuss how gender plays a role in their artistic and curatorial practices. So it really kind of connects in some way to some of the things you were discussing today. Kijo, would be a great way to continue. Maria is going to talk about her 9 years performing as Maria the Korean Bride, in which she dressed as a traditional Korean bride to marry people across the US, one in each state. It's quite an interesting project. And Swan McCormick will share some of the traditional Korean objects that are used in marriage ceremonies, which are on view in the current exhibition, Gold Needles, Embroidery Arts from Korea. Also, all program viewers are invited to watch Maria Yoon's 2013 documentary, which is about her performance in its entirety at no cost. You can find the link in the description for the October 7th program. So we'll see everybody in 2 weeks. Thank you, Kijo, for allowing me to jump on.
Of course, thank you so much, Andrew. And just so that you know, the October 14th Close Looking at a Distance will also feature Swan McCormick, and we'll do a deep dive into one object from the exhibition. Okay, great. So if you would like to explore more work from our collection, you can do so by visiting CMA Collection online, a link to which is in the Q&A. And if you have more questions that we couldn't get to today, you can also go to Artland's Ask on the CMA website, and someone will get back to you with an answer. Also, please remember to complete our Getting to Know You survey, as it helps us craft future programming. Thank you again for spending this time with us, and have a wonderful afternoon.